Research is to see what everybody else has seen and to think what nobody else has thought. It's about creating new knowledge. A very good evening to all the young and enthusiastic researchers who are joining with us today. You might be from different academic backgrounds, studying in different fields with different aspirations for the future. But whichever field you are from, if you want to learn more, create new knowledge, and contribute to a better world, research is something that you cannot steer clear of. Therefore, it's important to do research, and it is important to do it the right way. This webinar, A Beginner's Guide to Research Communication, is organized as a part of MERCON 2021, the Moratuwa Engineering Research Conference, which is the 7th international conference organized by the Engineering Research Unit, University of Moratuwa. This is done in collaboration with the IEEE Student Branch and IEEE Professional Communication Society Student Branch Chapter of University of Moratuwa. Today, in order to educate you on research communication, we have an exceptional researcher and a speaker who has achieved greater heights in his field. He will be sharing his valuable knowledge with us. And after his presentation, the audience can ask any questions you have through the Slido link, which will be provided in the Zoom chat. Without further ado, let me take the pleasure of introducing our guest speaker for today. He is a senior lecturer at the Department of Transport and Logistic Management of University of Moratuwa. He was the recipient of the Most Outstanding Graduate of the Year Award in 2013 at University of Moratuwa, in addition to obtaining the Gold Medal for Best Performance in Transport and Logistics Management. He subsequently obtained a PhD in Supply Chain Optimization from University of Sydney, Australia. He is a member of IEEE and has published numerous research articles on high-impact journals covering various facets of supply chain optimization. Please welcome Dr. Nilas Pereira. Sir, it is a great privilege to have you here with us today. Over to you.
Thank you, Jayod. I hope you all can hear me.
Yes,
thank you for the flattering introduction, much appreciated. And it's exciting to be part of this event. And I was a little taken aback when I got the invitation, but I'm really excited to be here and to share my knowledge. I must place on record my appreciation for the IEEE student branch of our university and the ProCom team for putting together this event. And I must tell you another important thing, that is that this is a field that we can never stop learning. Research communication keeps on changing, the requirements keep on changing, and it's something that you need to stay in touch, and it's not something that you can learn and forget about. You need to continuously learn. So there might be things that I might not be an expert at during this, which might pop up, but I will share essentially the key elements that I hope will be important to you based on my understanding. Right. So before we get started with the nitty-gritties and get our hands dirty, I want to get a feel of the environment. I want to get an understanding of who you are. So in order to do that, what I would invite you is to log into menti.com, right? You can use your smartphones, your laptops, any device, and then just type in the code 21070822. So after that, what will happen is essentially you'll basically be given a question, a couple of questions actually, and just fill them out. And that'll give us a lot of insight, because I can change gears based on the audience. So if you have a more bachelor's heavy audience, I think I can speak more about the fundamentals. But if there's more students who are towards the latter part of their degrees, or maybe starting their MScs, I think I can throw in a little bit of tidbits which might be useful for you all. So just take a couple of minutes and go through this, and then I think we can get ourselves started. Okay, so it's increasingly clear that we have a majority of students who are representing bachelor's level degrees. So that's good. That's encouraging. I think that's where we need to really inculcate the research spirit. And if you look at your specialization, I think we are still getting some responses. So we'll hold on for a few minutes until that wraps up. Okay, so thank you. That was good to understand who's in the room. Seems to be that there's quite a number of people from my home department, but I think there's a variety of people. So that means we'll have to sort of use analogies that match each discipline. Okay, so with that being sorted, I'm basically taking this presentation in several steps. And what I want to do is to establish a very fundamental understanding. We might not be able to go into advanced concepts, but if there's anyone who's interested, you can use the question and answer session to ask questions and make sure you get your questions clarified. So research basics, that's where we are going to start off this session with. And the first question is, why should we publish? Now, I'm assuming, I think there were a few of you who are not from our faculty, from the University of Moratuwa Engineering faculty, but I'm pretty sure all of you represent more or less scientific disciplines. So when we are looking at scientific research, we need to look at several things. One of the first things is it has to be grounded on scientific fact. We can't just come up with a concoction to cure COVID-19 and just sell it using media. That's not scientific, right? You need to have a very proven formula. You need to be able to test it. You need to be able to administer it properly. And then the evidence, the data should say, okay, this is something that works. And one of the important things in most scientific research is that it should be replicable. You should be able to do the same thing, and you cannot expect different results. You must be more or less getting similar results. And more often than not, what we do is we use various variables. We would change certain variables. We would have a control group. We will have a treatment. We will change certain factors. And based on that, we will see what is the outcome that is coming out of it. So in reality, what we are doing is, in terms of scientific research, we are step by step building on the foundation of where we are. And it's important to understand that when we are doing that, how do we really get that message across? If we do something, we would know what we did, but would the rest of the scientific community really know? And if they are not aware, we might end up in a situation where we would be reinventing the wheel. So let's say, for example, some of you get together, you come up with, let's say a few civil engineers get together, you do a research, you come up with a compound that would be suitable for rural roads, which is cost effective. Now, if you keep that with you, if you do not publish those data, if you do not put it out there, no one else would really know about it. And you'd have to go back to the drawing board. Someone else might have to go back and do the same thing. Alternatively, there is a feasibility, there's a likelihood that someone else might actually come up with something that you had already invented, and they might, run away with that idea. And there has been historical experiences or historical feedback that has come through, where certain people, like you might do a research, you might leave it at your university, someone else might publish it and get your credit, get the credit that you deserve, rather. So the important thing here is, when you do something, when you invent something, when you come up with a new contribution, it's imperative that you get it out there. It's imperative that you take that responsibility and the ownership of your work. And that's why you need to publish. Now, when we say publish, one of the important things that I always highlight to my students who are doing my undergraduate research or postgraduate research with me is that whenever they start something, I tell them the minimum expectation that I have is for you to publish in a good conference or a journal, right? So I always start with the notion that there should be a publication coming out of this. That is an imperative. If you do not start with that intention, especially if you're in your if you're just about to start your research, or if you're in an earlier year of your bachelor's and you're planning to do that later on, keep that in mind. Whenever you start, make sure you make a contribution to your field, you invent something or you prove something, and then don't just stop there. Don't just use your research just for the sake of filling the grades and moving on to the industry or for a different degree. Make sure you publish it, because that's very advantageous. That gives you a lot of credit in your career. I mean, even if you're going into a career which is devoid of academia, even if you want to become an entrepreneur or a corporate, still having done something in your particular field, having introduced new knowledge would be of tremendous value. So that's why you should publish. And another important thing, now, if you take, I mean, majority of you, I'm assuming, are from University of Moratuwa. So we know University of Moratuwa is a very good university, but if you take the international rankings and so on, we are not really up there, right? So even if you take the Asian rankings published by QS, I mean, Moratuwa is way behind some of our even local counterparts. So there are various factors that they consider for university rankings. I mean, there's a different debate about the accuracy of university rankings, how reliable they are. Let's not open that can of worms. But one thing that you can do to sort of, contribute to the university is publishing research, because that is one of the metrics that helps the university to improve its international recognition and to improve its international rankings. So also in that context, publishing is very, very important. So these are few things that you should consider, especially before you embark on doing research. Now, how do we really put those information out there? What is the mechanism of publishing? Now, one of the most common ways would be books. You would be familiar with the library. So if you go to the library, there would be a lot of scientific books on various disciplines. If you want to look at renewable energy, there might be books on that. There might be books on supply chain optimization. There would be books on construction management. There would be books on various facets of areas that are there. So books are a very good source of putting out knowledge, disseminating your knowledge. And similarly, you have book chapters. Book chapters are also very important. Now, what's the difference between a book and a book chapter? So one would say, yeah, okay, so books have chapters. That's not what I'm talking about. Book chapters are essentially coming out of books which are made by editors. So you'd have an editor. For instance, you'd have someone who is an editor, and they will be basically overseeing the compilation of a book. So they will invite different experts in the field to contribute to a particular book by writing a chapter for each individual topic. So for instance, they might write to you and say, you might be an expert in this particular field. Why don't you put up a small chapter on this particular domain? So likewise, they will invite you, or sometimes you might have to send a proposal to editors and get yourself invited to write a book chapter. So sometimes, especially supervisors, your supervisors, especially if you are in early stages of your research career, in your bachelor's or in your master's, you might need the help of your supervisor to get that invitation. Well, to be honest, I think with our team, for instance, I think we've had several instances where our undergraduates have published book chapters with us. A couple of years ago, with the 15 intake, I think there was one book chapter that came out of the final year research of one of my students. And I think out of the 16 intake also, myself and my colleague and friend, Dr. Miller, and another colleague, Dr. Anil, three of us together are on the verge of getting a book chapter. And there's one other book chapter that is also coming out of undergraduate work of one of my master students. So the point that I'm trying to say is, it's not beyond your reach. Book chapters are hard to get, but that does not mean it's impossible, especially if your supervisor has good contacts and if he or she has the capability of reaching out to potential editors. These are really good outlets to put out research. Then you have journal articles. Now, this is generally considered the top publication in academia. Some journals are almost impossible to get into. Some journals are pretty easy to get into. But generally speaking, having journal articles is really like the cherry on top of the cake. And journal articles take time, because you will have scientific journals in your field published by publication entities like Elsevier, Emerald, IEEE, InderScience, Taylor and Francis, and various other publishers, Springer, and they will be basically managing the journal. And what they will do is, when you are invited, or you can, without invitation, submit your work to a journal. So what happens in a journal is, they will go through a meticulous process, and then they will determine whether your manuscript is suitable for publication or not. It's a very time-consuming task, especially very well-recognized journals take a lot of time. I think very recently, we had a case where we had roughly about a year and a half, and there are certain journals which take about 4 years to publish, review and publish an article. And there are certain cases where you can get it published within 3 months. So it really depends on where you are targeting. And I think your supervisors would be better positioned, and they would know what journals to target. And we'll talk about that later. But journals are like the cherry on top of the cake. And if you can get journal articles, that's just fantastic. That's the ideal publication that would be there, because scientific research really dwells on journal articles. That is considered like the fundamental source for most of scientific research that you do. So the next one is conferences. Now, conferences are fun. Not these days when you have virtual conferences, but when you really have proper conferences, these are really good opportunities. You can travel, you can go to different parts of the world, you can get to know people, you can make connections, you can network, and there are lots of fun things you can do. I've been to quite a few conferences, and the experience of a conference is very unique. Now, a conference publication is not considered as, what would you say, not considered as prestigious or sound as a journal article, but conference publications are still very important. And in conferences, you might have different types of publications or different types of proceedings. So one type is you might have a full paper in the conference. So that's what we do at Mercon. So if you want to publish in Mercon, we have that every year in July. So even already we have talked about organizing it in July 2022, hopefully in a hybrid or an in-person mode if the situation improves. So if you want to target Mercon, you can have a 6-page paper. So that's a full paper. Alternatively, some conferences may publish an extended abstract of about 2-3 pages. And certain conferences might just ask you to publish a very short abstract of about 200-300 words. That's it. And certain conferences are there where you just have a poster publication. That means that you will be basically asked to condense all your research findings into one A3 sheet and just put it up on a wall. And you will be there like a demonstrator or an exhibitor. You'll be giving, anyone who's passing by, they may come and ask you what it is, what your research was, what you did. And you can basically pass comment and say, I did this, I did that, and so on. And they might give, the audience might give you feedback on. In a conference presentation, the 3 other options I told you earlier, you'll be presenting it live to an audience and they may give you feedback. So one of the most brilliant things about conferences is the feedback you get is live. It's in person and it's really good. And what most people do is they use a conference. What most researchers do is they use the conference to put the basic idea in, get an insight from the participants, get some comments, get some inputs, and they beef up the paper. They elongate the paper. They make it much more rich so that this paper can be submitted to a journal. That's what we generally do. I have done that many times, and I know many other academics who do it. So imperative, it's imperative that conference provide you a fantastic opportunity to grow. And I have to tell you this, I have noticed many people, not just students, but even seasoned academics who just go for the conference to just present their paper and that's it. Don't do that. That's my personal experience. If you go to a conference, try to network, try to learn as much as possible, try to learn from other people, and try to also explore the city that you'll be in, right? So I'll give you some examples. Like 2019 December, I was presenting a paper at IEEE Industrial Engineering and Engineering Management Conference in Macau. It was a 3 or 4 day conference, as I remember. And I always, I dropped into various sessions. I listened on speakers, I commented on some of the stuff, and I was able to basically develop some really interesting networks. I was able to get to know people. And one of the interesting things was one of the professors I met there invited us to work together. And now we have basically come to a point where we have won a grant, which is giving us a lot of funding to support research at University of Moratuwa. So if I just went for my presentation, I wouldn't have really got the opportunity to bring that grant to our university with the help of my colleagues. So that's the importance of this. You should be very open-minded when you go to conferences. I have a lot of co-authors in different parts of the world whom I met through conferences, and they work with me and in extension with my undergraduate or master's research students as co-authors. And that really improves the quality of research and the possibility of publishing. So conferences are very rich opportunities. And even if you publish something on a conference, if you can top that up with about 60-70% more content, you can continue that work and extend it into a journal. So that feasibility is also there. So always, if your supervisor is okay, try the path of going through a conference and get into a journal. That's something that is quite useful. Then you have technical reports. So technical reports, this is something that may mostly happen if you're working in a very technical organization. Let's say, for example, you go and work for Ceylon Electricity Board or something like that. Your career might not be entirely an academic career, you might not be interested in getting a MSc or a PhD, but in spite of that, you might be doing very scientific research on the work of a particular machine or a particular process or something like that. So for the sake of continuing that knowledge accumulation, you might put up a technical report that might go into the library. So that's something that is very interesting from a very from the standpoint of an employer. And then there are online dissemination. So you have certain websites online which use insights from various academics, and they publish it in online. So a very famous platform is The Conversation. The Conversation is a platform where you get a lot of scientists from various disciplines. They will be writing short pieces on particular domains, and that will be published on The Conversation. There are various international versions of Conversation, and you can read it. There are similar other platforms. Eon is another one. Eon is an online platform where you get a lot of people talking, especially about astronomy, about planetary sciences, about evolution. Mostly towards the natural sciences, but you see a lot of work in that domain. And there are lots of communities like that. I mean, even you can consider coming up with such a platform. And you would not be really very scientifically driven, but you'll still be doing something very interesting. Then patents. This, I think, is an underrated strategy to disseminate research, but it's very important. So patents are very important because if you especially have something intellectually important that needs to be protected, that you can use for commercialization purposes, you can get a patent for it. And it does not necessarily need to be a physical machine or a physical entity. It can also be even a process. So you can get a patent for a process or even a concept. If it's novel, you can get that. And in Sri Lanka, you have NIPO, National Intellectual Property Organization, I think. So if you come up with something, you can always go and get the patent from NIPO. So if you are getting that as a University of Moratu employee or a student, I think University of Moratu also holds a certain amount of the royalty, but it's easier to do that. We usually go through that channel. Alternatively, if you want to get a patent separately, I think there are different channels. I have not done that, so I'm not really familiar with it. And in addition to NIPO, I think the most famous patent office is basically USPO, United States Patent Office. So likewise, different jurisdictions have patents that protect your innovation from others. So basically, if you see someone stealing that, you can quickly sue them and you can use it. And also you can just sell the patent as a commodity. If you see a potential corporate organization who's willing to test that knowledge and make money, you can sell that for a particular amount of money or a royalty fee for additional units sold. So there are various mechanisms. I don't want to go into too many details, but patents are very important, something that people often underrate, but very important. And additionally, the last one that I want to mention is newspapers. Many people, well, there's another question. I mean, in Sri Lanka, most of the time you would not be, I mean, it will be hard to find a lot of newspapers that give enough coverage for scientific information, but still you can write op-eds, you can write articles, you can write certain things. When I was growing up as a kid, I used to read Vidusara a lot. I don't know whether the paper is there anymore or not, but there are various magazines or newspapers which you can get your information across, especially those who are part of IEEE. I think you might be aware that IEEE very recently started a newsletter. I think the first issue was published. So if you want to share something, that's one option. Alternatively, University of Moratu, the FGS, the Faculty of Graduate Studies, also started a new platform called Bolgoda Plains. So if you want to write something, you're welcome to do that. I think that's one of the purposes of the Faculty of Graduate Studies, to get the students engaged. So there are various platforms like that where you would be communicating things more towards the layman than the people from a scientific background. So these are some of these fundamentals that are out there. So now let me also move into research metrics. So research metrics are quite important. Research metrics can be classified under various channels. So you'll have the individual ones, and then you'll have the journal based or the outlet based ones. So often than not, these are very important and interesting citations that you'd want to look at. Citations is a very commonly used metric, and that is something that you will grow with time, right? So based on the years that you are active, you will have citations. So let me just show this to you. So if you go to Google Scholar, you can start a profile once you have publications. So this is my profile. So I'm not that experienced, well, comparatively, depends on whom you compare with, but you know, my citation count stands at 110. So that means 110 papers, 110 publications have cited my work, which means, like, for example, if you take this particular paper, the impact of renewable energy forecast errors on imbalance volumes and electricity spot prices. So 110 people have basically 110 works have 31 people have cited this as a important contribution in their work. So they have basically designed their research using this as a reference. So you agglomerate all of those and you get the citation count, right? So if you look at my supervisor, for instance, Benam Fahimnia at Sydney University, you can see it's 5,773. So if you look at someone that I had a meeting this morning, one of colleague, yeah, Stefan Soering, yeah, you can see this is 22,614. So likewise, this value citation, the higher it is, the better it is. And the interesting thing about this is this grows exponentially, right? It'll take you some time to, you know, get one citation. It'll take you sometimes to move from 1 to 2, from 2 to 5, from 5 to 10. But once you start moving, you'll really lose track of it, right? I mean, to give you context, I think every month or so, you'll end up, I mean, you end up getting accumulating exponentially the number of citations that are there, because over the time that it is there, and over the period of you know, contribution, you will be accumulating those inputs. The second one I want to mention is H index. H index is essentially a very interesting statistic that tells you how many significant papers have been there. So if H index equals 59, that means there are 59 publications from this particular author that has been cited at least 59 times. I hope that makes sense. So we'll move back to my supervisor's profile, Benam. So if you take Benam, that means 34 publications from Benam Fahimnia has been cited 34 times or more, right? So that means that, you know, if you have n number of papers that have been cited n times or more, your H index would be n. And this is something which takes time to grow. The higher the H index, the more better you are. And then you have the I-10 index. The I-10 index means that the number of papers where you have more than 10 citations, right? So in this case, it's 46. So, you know, it's not just about the number. So you can have a situation where you have one paper with about 100 citations, and the rest of the papers you have 1, 2, 5, 6, 7, something like that. That's not going to work. So it's just a matter of, you know, understanding what's the contribution. So if an I-10 value is quite high, that means you have several papers that have been cited 10 times or more. So these are individual metrics that you want to develop with your career. Maybe not so interesting for second or third year undergraduates, maybe not even that interesting for the third or fourth years, but yes, definitely for the master students, this is something to look out for. Then you have the outlet metrics, the journal metrics. So journal metrics are very interesting. So you have various things that you need to look at. And that is one of the important things that you need to look at is Schemajo journal rankings, right? So Schemajo journal rankings is quite interesting because it is something that gives you an idea of the standard of a journal. So you can go to this particular website, schemajojr.com. So you can look for a conference or a journal or anything. And when you go to it, it will give you a lot of information, right? So journals also have H indexes and all of that, but let us not worry too much about that. But when you go down, you will find out what quartile this journal represents. So this is in Q1. So Q1 is better. Then you have Q2, Q3, Q4. So if you can publish on Q1 journals or conferences, that's always considered better. And one of the interesting ways of finding this is through Schemajo. You can look at various outlets, see whether they have been ranked, see whether what their position is, and based on that, ideally go for something that is suitable for your work. Your supervisor will tell you whether you are, within that ballpark of publishing in a journal of this standard, or whether you need to dial down a little bit to a different rank level. But it's always good. I mean, sometimes what students always do forget, they forget to look into these things. They will just Google something, journal for cleaner production or for sustainable production, something like that. And they will find out, there's a conference. This conference is happening in this particular country. This is really nice. So I should ask my supervisor. All right. So you should not fall into that trap. You should do your due diligence. And there are lots of predatory journals out there. There are lots of predatory conferences out there. They will squeeze out money from you to publish, but you will not really reap the benefits, especially if you want to go on an academic career. So therefore, whenever you try to look for something to publish or to do something, always seek your supervisor's expertise. He or she will know better because they have that experience. And also look at the Schemajo website, because that's where you will be able to find a lot of information. Then you have site score. So site score is a metric that has been derived by Elsevier to sort of give an insight on what is the level of publication that is there. So this is an example. This is one of my favorite journals, European Journal of Operational Research. So basically, they look at citations numbers of the past 4 years, and they do various calculations, and they basically give a score for each journal based on that. And on that note, I'd also like to mention that you have impact factor. Impact factor is basically another calculation which is done using the number of citation, the average number of citation that a journal or a conference accumulates across a particular calendar year, right? That is something, you look at for 2 consecutive years as well. So it's a very interesting understanding that you can derive through these about the suitability or the standard of a particular journal. But that does not really mean that these are accurate, right? There are cases where you might find journals with high impact factors, but which might not be as attractive or scientifically grounded as some journals that are out there. So you have to be very, very careful in determining those things. I think there's another whole different argument about open access publication. OA stands for open access, but I don't want to really open that can of worms right now unless you have those as questions later on in the section. So this is the research metrics. I think there was a lot of discussion that I understood from the organizers that there needs to be some understanding about research metrics. So I think that gave you a brief understanding of what it is. So the next topic that I want to really talk about is active reading. Now, this is very important, and this is something I feel many academics get wrong. Now, when I was an undergraduate, I'd be very honest with myself, right? When I heard the term literature review, I was wondering, what does literature have to do with anything with my module, my subject discipline? I was so so oblivious to research at that particular point in my life. But the reality is, literature review or literature means the extant knowledge on a particular field, what has been done and what has been published. That's why it's important to publish. And one of the very famous quotes of Sir Isaac Newton, who supposedly popularized, well, some people say invented gravity, but that's not true. We all know that. But he was the one who basically made it scientifically, explain the theory of gravity scientifically. And that's why he's so well known and so well respected. And one of his very famous quotes is, if it's that if I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. So this term, standing on the shoulders of giants, is applicable for all of us. In human civilization, we always do things by learning from our predecessors. We learn from our parents. We try to take a step beyond what our parents took. And we learn from our teachers. We try to take a step beyond that, not disrespecting them, but by trying to make them proud and to advance human civilization. And that's how human civilization has progressed. And that should be the same case in scientific research. So whenever you are doing something, you should stand on the shoulders of giants. You need to look at past literature, what has been published, what patents are out there. So for instance, if you're coming out with an innovation, we need to do a patent search, and you need to go through some of those databases and find out whether there is something similar. If you are doing a research, you need to go through these sorts of research databases or search engines and try to figure out whether there are things. For instance, University of Moratuwa has free access to Scopus. If you are joining in from our uni, or even if you are joining in from home, you can contact library. They have a special setting that you need to set up in your computer. You can use Scopus or IEEE Explore free from your home or from the university. These are very expensive resources, but our university has given you that luxury. So you can search. I don't want to take time to show how that is done. That's something that I can talk for hours about, but I don't want to go into that wormhole. But if you take Scopus, for example, there are various strategies you can use. There are various, Boolean expressions that you can use to make sure you couple in various important factors together. But one way or the other, the important point is these research databases are important. When you start a research, don't just Google previous literature, right? Don't just Google your topic and try to find out works. Try to go through the right way, the scientific way, by looking at Scopus, looking at IEEE Explore. Scholar is okay, but I wouldn't say the best source. I generally prefer Scopus and IEEE Explore. Science Direct is also part of the Scopus family. It's Elsevier. All of these, not all of these, Scopus, Science Direct, and Mendeley are owned by Elsevier, which is a major publishing house. So Science Direct essentially covers almost everything that is there in Scopus. So these are really good sources for you to find extant literature, top quality stuff, right? Not the basic ones, not something that makes the mark, something that is really good. And I think everyone knows that you would have heard about this story or this analogy. If you put garbage in, you get garbage out. So if your research does not really use very good literature published in good journals, good conferences, the output you are going to get is not going to be any better. You need to use the right literature to create the platform for your research. So that's why it's doubly important that you pay a lot of attention to your literature review. You use these good resources that is at your disposal to find really good literature, and oftentimes try to find those sources from top ranked journals and conferences, stuff that are ranked Q1 or Q2, because when you use those best research to ground your work and to scope what you want to do, that always gives you a push up, and that's the first step of publishing in a good journal. If you have defined your research using works from not so well ranked journals and not so well ranked conferences, so to speak, your chances of going and publishing in a very high standing outlet would be low. But if you were to do this, your chances increased by 2-3 folds. So that's something very important. And out of this, I especially want to point out Mendeley is a very important tool. You can download it, it's open access. It's really good in managing your literature. So whenever you download something, you can keep it. It's a reference manager, and it gives you a lot of value add. And I think also online, when you go to a website, also you can sometimes put a paper. You can basically, like when you go to the paper website itself, you can add it into Mendeley. I think that option is there. I'll just try to, yeah, I can't quickly find it, but that option is essentially there. So if anyone is interested, Mendeley is a really good tool that I strongly recommend. I use that often. So a few important things about how you should read. So what should you do? Many people like to read the printed version, and some people like to read on a device. My recommendation is to use a device. The reason is, well, in the early parts of my PhD, I took printouts of all the papers I wanted. I read them, and I highlighted them line by line. I put down notes. I wrote on them. I really liked the feeling of reading in a nice chair or laying on the bed and reading. So I thought that was the way to go. But then what happened was, when I was supposed to write the research proposal, I realized I have everything in my head, but I don't really remember who said what, because you need to cite and refer what people are saying, and that's very important. So putting it on a device, reading off the device and highlighting it is very important. And if possible, have a Word document separately open so that you can take down notes and say, okay, this paper has this particular point. And you can use various tools on PDF softwares to highlight stuff, to color code things and so on. So color coding, especially when you're reading, is a very good way of understanding things. So what I usually do is I come up with 3-4 different colors: yellow, green, blue, maybe purple, and I highlight different text in different colors based on the importance. Say, for example, if I want to cite something, I would highlight in yellow. If I want to, if there's a very important reference that I need to refer to, I would highlight in blue. If there's something that would be defining a research gap, I would highlight in purple. So likewise, I would have my own color code. This can be different from one person to the other, but you can use those to highlight it. And once that is highlighted, you can basically use, you can basically put it into a research database like Mendeley. Zotero was something my friend Dr. Amila Tibotuava suggested I also mentioned. EndNote is also another option, but I think University of Morato doesn't really have the license for EndNote. EndNote is not open source. These two softwares are open source. Adobe has a lot of interesting features. Adobe Reader DC. I'm very familiar to this, but I'm now gradually becoming quite fond of Drawboard PDF. It's quite cool. So one example that I want to perhaps show you is, like, this is a paper that it's not really I mean, there are certain things we need to change. I hope my student won't mind. This is a paper that we really very recently got up online. So if you want, like, say, for example, if you want to highlight something, you can just select everything, right? And then you can simply use this highlight button, right? And oops, so it'll automatically highlight. So if you want to change the color, you can change the color like this, right? So if you think you want to color code it accordingly, you can do it that way. Another important thing is, like, if you want, you can add a comment, right? Say, for example, you want to add a comment, you can just they call it sticky notes, so you can put a sticky note saying this is an interesting point. If you want to note it down, I mean, you can do a lot of things. Drawboard has really cool options where you can, even in your mobile phone, you can scribble on a paper, you can put something out there. So Mendeley basically can keep track of all of these. So you will have the papers in Mendeley and or Mendeley or Zotero, for example. I have not really used Zotero, but there are various tools which you can basically use to keep those important points. So once you read it also, you can basically skim through the paper. You can look at the highlighted points and try to understand what were the important things that you want to really take into consideration. Another important thing is, whenever you start, I mean, if you get a novel into your hands, you will always start reading from front to back. You wouldn't want to read the last paper and see, the main character dies. Oh, how sad. And then you don't want to go back to the start of the novel. You'll start from the beginning and move to the end. But here, in academic reading, what I strongly recommend is something totally different. You can start off by looking at the abstract. So the abstract is very important. You can get an understanding of the abstract. Then, generally what I always do is, after the abstract, I would read the conclusion. So you will go down to the conclusion and try to understand the conclusion. So if those two are relevant, then you can read the introduction. What I generally recommend my students is to skip the methodology until you come to the point of defining your research. So I generally say, read the introduction, read the abstract, read the conclusion, read the introduction, maybe the results, but don't worry too much about the methodology until you want to do the study. That's something that I strongly believe. And also, if this is a publication made on, let's say, Elsevier based journals, you have this new thing called highlights. So whenever you are submitting a paper, you need to come up with highlights. So highlights are, if I remember correctly, you can have 3 to 5 sentences of 85 characters, right? Not words, 85 characters. So that basically gives you a very important insight. So even before you read the abstract, you can look at the highlights. So they say, okay, these are the things that are important. So you look at it. If it's relevant, you can read it. If it's not relevant, you can forget about it. The important thing is, you should not be wasting your time reading something that is not really relevant to you. It's good to learn these things, yes, but try to learn, try to understand what is relevant and what is not relevant. So this is something I would generally recommend to you. Okay, so these are critical things that you should understand in terms of literature reviews. But be creative, try to use a lot of tools. That is very, very important. All right, so that concludes the part that I want to talk about, literature. So now let's talk about academic writing. So academic writing, again, that's a whole topic in itself. I don't want to take too much time, but I'll tell you the very basics. So the point of view is very important in academic writing. So many people, in English, if you have learned English, you know that there's first person, second person, and third person. Generally in academic writing, we don't consider second person. We consider first person or third person. Many people who are old school prefer third person, right? Saying this study was done by the authors and blah, 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 and so on and so forth. Whereas people of my generation prefer first person. Some people say third person is the way to do academic research. That's not true. There are lots of American-based journals which are using first person. In fact, my supervisor is very keen on using first person. He doesn't like writing in third person. So a couple of days back, I sent a paper to him, something that we are working jointly, and he's very keen to keep that first person writing. But on the flip side of the story, sometimes we get feedback. Very recently, I had two of my undergraduate students from the 16 intake doing research on maritime transport. Both of their papers got accepted, but one of the main comments from the reviewers was, this is written in first person, change third person. So there's a dichotomy there. But I think the important thing here is you need to understand the nature of the journal and also get some insights from your supervisor. It's safer to write in third person because no one says third person is bad, but I think it's more personal if you can write in first person. So that's why I prefer that. But there has been instances we've got into trouble where we had to change the text. We did that with my previous two projects that I cited. So this is from Grammarly, and Grammarly is a really interesting tool because you can check your grammar, and that's somewhere we often fail to some degree. So as non-native speakers, I think Grammarly is a really useful tool that you should definitely use to improve your grammar. So engaging the reader is something that I want to especially highlight. So transitioning from your mother tongue to English is very challenging, and it's only made difficult by the fact that 13 years, or I'd say 10 years of learning English at school teaches us to be good in classical English. It teaches us from starting from writing 5 sentences about myself to writing an essay about something. So we are taught to express ourselves from a literary perspective, from a classical English perspective. But scientific community does not condone that. They don't want that. They don't want that literature, the classical element of English. So you have to be very miserly. So you have to be very careful in transition into that language, and especially thinking in Sinhala or Tamil and writing in English is quite challenging. But be very careful. Whenever you write something, read it 1 or 2 times at least, so that you understand that it makes sense. You have to fix the settings on Microsoft Word. I don't want to go into details of that right now, but if you have questions, I can answer. So generally have a higher font size, have a good line spacing in between, try to use the features like headers and so on. Those are very important in sort of determining what you're going to put out there and the readability of that, so that the paper does not look congested. Then before you start, plan the flow properly. You have to have a proper structure. So generally what I do is whenever I start writing, I jot down the bullet points, the subheadings that I want to cover. So I mentally prepare and say, okay, these are the ones that I want to cover. So I put down introduction. Okay, under introduction, I'll be covering these points. Then literature review, I'll be covering these points. Methodology, these points. Data analysis and results, these points. Conclusion, so on and so forth. So you put the skeleton first and then try to cover the skeleton with content. This is not something many people do. I have noticed some people just start writing, they keep on writing, and it's not a congruent document. It's not a cohesive document that elicits the idea properly. So flow and structure is very important. The reader should not feel like you're reading two or three different things when they are reading the document. That has to be like a story. Really good papers are so interesting that you can read it as if you are reading a story. So that flow and structure is so important in getting that. Then use simple language. Don't use complicated language. Don't try to complicate things by using very complex grammar. Don't try to use very difficult vocabulary. Some people try to use synonyms, right, to sort of show off that they know English or they are competent in English. Sometimes they use synonyms to evade the plagiarism checks. I don't recommend that. Try to use simple words as much as possible. If you can use the word compare and juxtapose, use compare. Don't confuse the reader by using something like just a pose, which might not be very familiar to many people. So likewise, use very simple words. Simple words communicate the point better. Make your research findings complex. That's fine. That's what we should be focusing on. But when you're communicating, use simple, short sentences. We Sri Lankans generally use a lot of long sentences, and let's avoid that. Use very simple sentences. That's something that I strongly believe. Right? I had a quick quiz in mind also, but we'll perhaps skip that in the interest of time. Avoid using adjectives. Adjectives often elongate the message and exaggerate what you have done. Right? So don't exaggerate your work. In scientific community, exaggerating your work is not encouraged. It's considered to be something, bad. So always be a little bit humble in communicating what you have done or what you have found, without trying to exaggerate unnecessarily. And whenever you have too many commas in a sentence, that means the sentence is too long. So break down the sentences. If you have too many commas, that means that's a cue for you to break down the sentences. Check your writing for perfection. So use Grammarly to make sure that your grammar is good, and also double or triple check for typos. That is very important. You should not get flagged for that, because when we are non-native speakers, we often get flagged for that. That is a little embarrassing. So try to avoid that. And finally, use of visualization. This is very important. So use tables, figures, infographics, stuff like that wherever possible. And especially try to go beyond using Excel or something, right? If you can bring in some visualization from R or from Power BI or from Python or wherever you can do that, it'll be very attractive. It'll be very attractive to the reader. So make it very attractive. Have some visualization in between, and properly number the tables and figures, right? If it is a table, the caption should be on top of the table. You keep stuff on top of the table, so the caption should be on top. If it's a figure, it should be at the bottom. If there's an equation, number the equation. So likewise, make sure you keep a mental map of everything, so that anyone who's looking at it can easily understand. Visualization is very important. And also be very careful when you are having charts. Use black and white as much as possible. Consider the fact that people might print this out in black and white. So if you have a chart with different colors, especially if you can't really differentiate two colors, then the reader may get confused. So always use patterns in your charts. If you're having a bar chart or a pie chart or whatever that is, try to have patterns along with colors, so that if someone takes a black and white printout, they can clearly understand what it is all about. So these are very important. Visualization plays an important role. There's a whole heap of research on how visualization impacts research. There's a group of researchers called Mavis, based out of USA, which basically talks about visualization and in its impact in research. I was part of that group 4 or 5 years ago, but I'm no longer in touch, so I don't really know what the state of art is there in that domain, but it's very important. And now certain journals are requesting people, are suggesting people to come up with a graphical abstract whenever you submit a paper. It's not compulsory yet, but it can be. Earlier highlights, which I showed you earlier, was not compulsory, but now it is compulsory. So we might come to a point where every publication might be requiring you to have a graphical abstract. I mean, highlights are compulsory for Elsevier publications only, right? So that might be the case with Elsevier for graphical abstracts as well. Right. So that's the part about research writing, something very, very important, something that we can talk for hours on end. But I don't want to stop there. So we are going to talk about some important housekeeping in research. Research integrity. So research, when you talk about referencing, some people use the term bibliography. and references interchangeably. This is wrong. Bibliography is just a list of books that you have read, books or documents. It's just a reading list, right? References means you have referred to them and you have all the details of those references. So in academia, we should use references, not bibliography. So don't get that wrong. Many people I have seen, I mean, sometimes very recently, I got a master's thesis to evaluate as an examiner, and the student had used bibliography. That is incorrect. So you should not make that elementary mistake. You can use reference management tools. So depending on where you are targeting, their referencing style would be different. So if you take IEEE based publications, they have IEEE. If you take certain journals, they have their unique styles. And those are actually loaded on these reference management tools. For example, if you take Mendeley, they have these tools. So you can install Mendeley, you can install the plugin, and you can use the relevant tool appropriately. So that is very important, and it eases the process of referencing a paper. And then you have to pick the correct referencing style. So your department for your thesis may have a particular style that they have, set as the formality. Or else if you are targeting a journal, there would be different styles, right? For example, this is a paper. Yeah, so I'll show you a couple of papers. This is one paper of one of my 16 tech students. So this is something we did with a professor in US. So in this work, we are supposed to go with this particular style, right? The number base. That's what the Omega journal that we are targeting is requiring. Alternatively, this is a paper which is accepted but is still waiting for publication by another student from my 16 intake research cohort. And in this one, you can see it's basically alphabetical. So it's a variant of APA style. So likewise, different journals will have different styles, and one needs to be cognizant of those styles because these are easy things that people may pick on and say your paper is not up to our standard. So you need to have those things. And whenever you have a reference list, triple check. That is very, very important. You have to be very careful to be aware of this. Sometimes we assume the system that gets things right. We assume the reference management tool gets it right, but it does not happen always. So therefore, make sure you triple check the reference list. Check whether every information is properly recorded. And it's also important that the DOI numbers are properly mentioned. DOI number means it's basically a number that is given to any academic publication, and you can trace documents through that. So when the DOI number is there, it's easy for reference engines. So you have bots that calculate the number of citations, and that's how your scholar profile or OSIT profile gets updated. So DOI numbers or DOI numbers are easy to be captured by those bots. So using DOI is a really good way of giving the proper accountability and respect for your predecessor or predecessing work. So be very mindful of the reference. Plagiarism is also equally important. So you need to make sure you should basically what I'm trying to say in this particular point is you should avoid bypassing the plagiarism check. So you need to make sure, some people come up with various mechanisms to bypass. Don't do that. Go through that, because that's a good way of understanding how new you are. I mean, how novel your work is. And one of the best ways of doing that is, rather than quoting, try to paraphrase. So whenever you are picking something out from a paper, paraphrase that as your own thought, rather than basically taking the same thing and copying. So paraphrasing and representing it as your own idea is ideal, and that is the best way of doing a literature review. So the important thing is, don't get flagged by Turnitin for high similarity indexes. And one of the best ways of managing that is by making sure you are novel and innovative as much as possible, and you write things in your own words, and don't use that shortcut of using synonyms to avoid being flat, right? That makes it very difficult for someone to read it, and you will lose more marks than get into the turn it in for plagiarism. So in University of Moratuwa, especially this is enforced for postgraduate degrees. The allowed similarity level for academic thesis at University of Moratuwa is 10%. So you have to basically have 90% or more original content. In our department for undergraduate research, we also have that 10% rule. I don't know whether that's abided by the rest of the departments, because undergraduate level research, the freedom has been given to each department to decide, as far as I know, from the faculty board. But keep it as low as possible. And one of the very important things, many people mistake this, you should not be counting the preamble, the reference list, the acknowledgements, and various different components in counting the similarity. Many people make that mistake. Very recently, I got a master's, a few master's thesis, and the relevant coordinator had actually looked for a reference list and preamble and so on. That's misleading, and it's not really good. So if you get something as a student, if your plagiarism level is checked accordingly, be very careful, double check things. If anything is there with these particular domains, you can reduce it and say, this is not plagiarism. So please don't consider that. All right. So another important, another key points before we wrap up: authorship. So in terms of authorship, there are a few important things to consider. The author sequence. This is very, very important. So you need to decide who's going to be the first author. Generally, the first author is the person who makes the biggest contribution to your paper. So generally speaking, it might be the case that you write the majority of the paper. If that is the case, you are eligible to be the first author. If you are the one who is leading the project, if you have the funding for the project, you might have a claim to be first author. But generally, the rule of thumb is that if you have written the majority of the paper, or if you have done the majority of the work related to the paper, you should be the first author. So generally, as a rule of thumb, in my supervision work that I do, my undergraduate researchers or postgraduate researchers are often offered to be the first author. So that's the case with most of the work that I show. Generally, the second author, if you have a pool of researchers, you can pick based on the deteriorating level of contribution, the second, third, and so on. If you are a team, let's say you're a team of researchers. I know, for example, in the electrical engineering department, you do final year projects together. So if that is the case, you can put all 4 names, and then you can put a note and say all 4 authors contributed equally to this paper. So you can put a footnote there. You can put a small note and a footnote at the bottom of the first page saying that all of you contributed equal. So if that is the case, that makes sure that the author attribution is done properly. This is a very important point. So therefore, be very careful. If you have done something in a paper, and you should not allow someone else to publish without your name. There are various ways to avoid that, but make sure if you have made a contribution that your name is carried, and it is carried in the right place. That is very, very important. That is fundamentally important for everyone to consider. And then there should be a corresponding author. The importance of the corresponding author, well, the corresponding author's role is a thankless task, to be honest. Corresponding author has to liaise with the journal or the conference or whoever is organizing the outline. So you have to send emails, you need to submit things, you need to work with them. So they are basically the communicator. They communicate with the outline. So generally, it's the supervisor or a senior person in the research team is the corresponding author. It requires a little bit of experience, but that's something any researcher needs to develop over time. So in my personal perspective, whenever I supervise a student's work, I am the corresponding author and often the second or third author. But when they come to maturity, I hand them over the baton of being the corresponding author. Then selecting the publication outlet. Now, this is a very challenging task. This is something that you need to talk continuously with your supervisor and make sure you target where you are going to go. That's very important. So when your work starts materializing itself, probably about halfway stage, halfway to 3/4 of your work, you need to decide where you are going to target. That's a discussion you need to have with everyone and decide. Copyrights, there are various ways of copyrights that are there. Oftentimes when you submit to some journals, they will be having the copyright over your content, especially to distribute your content. Sometimes you might not really have the ownership to distribute the content, but you will have the copyright for the intellectual property. So for example, if you take some Elsevier journals, you can't distribute your work legally for 2 years, but you have right for the intellectual property. If you take IEEE, for example, you are basically having to sign. I mean, everyone has to basically electronically sign saying we are giving the copyrights to that particular organization, and they will be basically putting it based on subscription. And we are not really allowed to share it until a particular grace period is over. Alternatively, a very famous thing that is happening that we are seeing often is that we see open access publications being very, very popular. So sometimes research groups pay a lot of money, $2,000, $3,000, and so on, to publish your work. But Sri Lanka, we are not in such a position. So you should not really be looking at it unless your supervisor has a lot of funding. And if you publish open access, like in the case, I mean, this was actually because we were given a very unique opportunity by this journal. Not that we had the money, but this is open access gold. So when you have open access gold, you can publish it and anyone can access it, and we can show it around. We can send it to anyone. So we have the authority to do that. And it's also important to consider responsible management of data and equipment. So when you do something, you need to maintain the data properly. You need to keep it safe and secure with you. You should not be putting it in common places, especially if there's human data there. And even if you do some sort of an innovation with a physical thing, you should not be leaving it after your research and going home. You should properly dismantle it, or you should keep it in proper storage. You should make sure these things don't get out and become hazardous to the public or to anyone who's there. So it's essential, it's completely important that you do your due diligence and you do something properly in managing your data and equipment so that it does not create any environmental or social hazards that are there. So this is something that you should be very much cognizant about, and this is something many people often forget, but managing your data and equipment is that much important. Right, so that's the end of the presentation. Took a little more than I initially anticipated, but I hope I was able to communicate the important points to you. So thank you very much to everyone for the support in going through this and making sure that you got the idea. I hope you got the idea. And I'd like to thank everyone who was supportive towards this task and wind up. Jayada, over to you, and you can probably take it on from here.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Nilas, for that interesting and insightful presentation. And thank you for encouraging us to do research and emphasizing its importance. So I'm sure our audience is going home with an abundant new knowledge about research communication. So before moving on to the Q&A session, I have a small request from our audience. Let us turn on our cameras and pose for a group photo, if possible. Can someone from the, yes, Mudita?
Yeah, sure. Can someone, thank you. I will be taking the photo at 3. I say like 1, 2, and 3. I'll be taking the photo. Give me 1 minute. Thank you. Over to you, Chaitanya.
Thank you, Mudit. Thank you very much. So now it is time for you to clear any doubts that you have related to research communication. So please direct your questions to us through the Slido link given in the Zoom chat box, and we will be directing them to Dr. Nilas. I think we have some questions there already. So Dr. Nilas, are you there? Yeah, so the first question is, what are preprint servers and what is the benefit of publishing on them?
Yeah, so I think preprint servers, there are various sources like SSRN. Well, I'm not really entirely sure whether there's a advantage of it other than you getting your idea out there. Certain universities actually have those, like you can put a working paper there. And if there's someone who might be giving you feedback, you can collect that feedback and improve the paper. But essentially, it's not as I mean, you're also putting yourself in a little bit of danger because someone might pick up some of these contents and they might also try to do something replicable. So I haven't really used that, so I'm not really entirely sure of what are the benefits than what I have actually pointed out up to now.
Thank you, sir. When we are submitting a paper, is it necessary to submit the files which contain the data analysis part of the research? Like
no. Yeah, so I mean, it's quite, it's in your hands really. So for instance, if you really want to be thorough, if you're really, if you feel that it's going to argue for your case, you can do that. But based on my experience, I mean, I have never done that. The reason is because if the reviewers have any doubt, they would actually ask for those files. In my case, I mean, I have never really had that case where the reviewers would say, why don't you share this and that and all the Excel sheets and so on. So unless that is really requested, I don't really as a policy submit that, primarily because if you have too much information, that might also sort of complicate the review process, and it might confuse the reviewers. So generally what happens is, oftentimes when we do a research, we have a myriad of data and we need to pick out what we are really going to look for. And we might not be really reporting on all the data either. So I think we as the authors are more cognizant of what we have done, what the data that we have in our arsenal, and what we can deduce through that. But if you share all the data with the reviewers, I think that creates a lot of complexity. So as a result of that, generally myself and most of my research colleagues that I work with have always sort of stuck to the guns of submitting the most important documents and keeping out the data analysis out of it.
Thank you for that comprehensive answer. So the next question is, if you hope to publish a literature review paper, are considering books, book chapters, and conference reviews recommended along with journal articles? Yeah,
so that's a very good question. If you want to publish a literature review paper now, especially if it's a journal, the rule of thumb is most of the literature review papers oftentimes only focus on journal articles. So that's something that generally we have done. I mean, I have published a couple of literature review papers, systematic reviews. In both the cases, we excluded book chapters and books. But that does not necessarily mean that you should always do that. The important thing here is if you have scientific evidence. Now, in our case, what we found was we found a lot of publications on books and book chapters and conferences which were not really properly indexed or which have not gone through a proper review process. So our argument in both of those papers were, if this has not been reviewed, peer reviewed by scientists in that particular domain, it's not suitable to be considered as part of a literature review. So often books are not peer reviewed. Book chapters can get peer reviewed, but not always. Conferences, again, can go either way. but journal articles are always peer reviewed. So therefore, we usually go with the norm of journal articles. But that does not mean that there's a hard and fast rule. So if there's scientific evidence, or you can argue for the case, yes, books and book chapters have scientific knowledge, it has been peer reviewed, or it is important, it captures knowledge which is not previously captured on journals, I think you have a case to include them. So there's no hard and fast rule, but I think it's very subjective, and you need to make the argument for or against what you want to do. That's my personal perspective.
Yeah, the next question is, when I published my undergraduate research last year, I received a request to publish extended paper in journal. What should I do? Could you explain?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that's something that happens to a lot of us. First thing, I'm assuming this is a conference paper, so this is what usually happens. So if you go to a conference, they will pick up your paper and they will send you an email saying, we read this work and we are really interested in this work and we want to publish a journal article. The first thing you should do is you should check what the journal is. Because sometimes what happens is sometimes you will get emails from predatory journals. So they would be saying, you should come and publish. We are publishing this many times. And then eventually they would try to basically trap you into paying an extra amount of money. So the first step is making sure whether the journal is legit or not. If it is legit, if it's a legitimate journal, if it's a proper academic journal, especially you can verify that through Schemajo. If that is the case, then what you should do is you should beef up what you already have. So you should try to rewrite. What I would ideally recommend is don't start from that particular paper that you already published in the conference. Start from scratch and then develop something. Develop something that extends on what you have done in the conference. So ideally, you should be adding, for most journals, it should be basically if you take 100% of the paper, 60% or more should be original content that has not been part of the conference paper. So that means you need to add a lot of things. You need to at least triple what you have done for your conference. And you should basically come up with something now. But be very careful, because lots of predatory journals they pick up papers that were published in conferences and they email you saying, we really loved reading this. We want to really publish this. Why don't you do this? Why don't you give us a meeting, and so on. And oftentimes what happens is you get sucked into a potential wormhole where they are asking for money and all of these things. So be very careful. I think get your insights from your supervisor also, because they would be better informed about the source of that request. I hope that clarifies it.
Yeah, the next question is how to avoid self-plagiarism.
So I think self-plagiarism is not really bad as long as you can cite yourself. So let's say, for example, you submit your thesis. If you submit your thesis, you might have certain contents. 2 months later, you might be submitting a conference paper or a journal paper. And you are basically picking stuff out from your thesis for the paper. If that is the case, there's nothing wrong in it, as long as it's your original content. And that would be the case, I would assume. So this happened to us once, 3 or 4 years ago. I think we published a paper on Mercon, and we got flagged basically for similarity index was quite high. And there was a question that came from the editors asking, you have a lot of content that is overlapping with something that has already been submitted. And we looked at it, and it was actually our own work, which we had put up somewhere else. So if that is the case, what we did was we sent a justification saying this was the original research, and we are basically taking something out of that to publish. If that is the case, it's quite okay. No one really picks on you if it's self-plagiarism and you haven't really published that unless you have published that as a conference paper or a journal, you're okay. Especially picking stuff out from a thesis, perfectly fine. So don't worry about it. That's my advice.
Thank you, sir. Is there any exercise or activity that I can get involved in the long run to gradually improve my writing style?
Yeah, I think there are many things that I can say, but in the interest of time, I'll give you a few things. First thing, read really good papers that are very neatly written. So that really gives you a lot of perspective on how to use language to communicate research better. That's the first thing that I would want to highlight. That's very important. The second thing I want to highlight is that whenever you write, read 3-4 times, right? I used to do that a lot. When I went for my PhD in Sydney, I thought I knew English very well. I was pretty good. I was very confident in my academic writing. But when I sent my proposal to my supervisor, he sent something back entirely read with track changes and comments. So then I realized something was really wrong with me, and I worked really hard. I read everything I write 2-3 different times just to see whether the message comes through. So when you really continue to read what you do over and over again, you learn new things. And also, when you have good co-authors, that also helps. Especially good co-authors would be, good in English. They will always give you insights. Why don't you write it like this? Why don't you do it according to this particular manner? So there are lots of things you can do. Like small tweaks will lead a long way, but that's something you need to continuously focus on. So that's something I strongly suggest. Be very mindful of not also bringing in anything from classical English into your academic writing. Many people make that mistake, so avoid that, right? Always try to switch off your classical English knowledge whenever you are writing something academic. That's also something I strongly recommend. Yeah, that's probably the best things that I can share right now.
Yes. So the next question: what is the relevance of getting a research paper peer reviewed?
Yeah, I think in most cases that is the norm of publication. That is a prerequisite for publishing. So, for instance, if we take Mercon, we have to submit the paper, and we basically, I can tell you that because I'm part of the organizing committee. We basically send it to 2 or 3 different authors in that particular field. Most of the time, people with PhDs in that field, and they will peer review it, and they will come back to you with various comments. So that will basically tell you whether the paper is good or bad, what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, what needs to be improved. So generally, the peer review process improves the paper. And that's why peer reviewed publications are highly regarded. Whether it's a conference or a journal, it's highly regarded. And that's what, that is the norm. And what I always encourage is, whenever you're publishing, go for the peer reviewed path. Hope that makes sense.
Yes. So there's another question. Could you give us a comprehensive list of types of research papers?
Yeah, I think types of research papers varies from journal to journal. Different journals have different categorizations. So it's very difficult for us to really say this is exactly what it is. So most of the time, the common argument that you have is theory and methodology and empirical. So there are two major classifications. So you have theory and methodology, which mainly focuses on the nuts and bolts of, how can we improve the theory, or how can we improve the methodology? How can we include a new variable into an algorithm? Something like that. Or how can we basically extend the research by bringing new compounds into a chemical process or something like that. So that's theory and methodology. On the other hand, you'd have empirical, which is basically testing something out in the empirical world, in the real world. So most of the time that is the classification, but beyond that you have various others based on the different journals that are there. A very common one is you will have literature reviews, which is very common, and then you have book reviews or paper reviews. So sometimes even people will review a paper saying, oh, this paper is interesting, but there are certain problems that were not reported in this paper, or the math in this paper is wrong and it needs to be corrected. So there are avenues like that also. Most often, the easiest way you can find out is if you figure out a target journal. Now you can easily create a user login for using your email address. And whenever you go for the option of submitting a new paper, it will give a drop down of the various research paper types that are entertained by that particular journal. So that is a good way of picking out what would be the options that are available in each of those outlets. But generally speaking, the more predominant things that pop up are theory and methodology. Then you have empirical and reviews of extant work. That means literature reviews or book chapter reviews or reviews of papers. So that's the backbone of it, but there are many varieties that you can see based on the journal that you're targeting. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Is using latex overleaf, for example, essential?
Yeah, that was something that I wanted to touch on. I forgot. I kept it in my notes, but I forgot to say that. So latex is very good. It's actually more foolproof than Microsoft Word. So traditionally, a lot of research has been done on, research writing has been done on latex, but that does not mean latex. That does not mean that we need to use that. What I've seen is a lot of people are now moving to Microsoft Word a lot because 2 or 3 different reasons. One is compatibility. It's quite compatible. You can use it in collaborative work. You can share the paper around when you have 3-4 different authors, perhaps from different universities, and you can use it on a platform like Microsoft Teams. But still, you have some people who are using latex. So if you have a pool of authors, if your co-authors are comfortable using latex, going ahead with latex is fine, because latex is quite foolproof. You might not be having too many formatting errors. Once you sort it out, once you sort out the coding, the referencing using BibTeX and so on, it's quite simple. You don't have to check the document over and over again. It's very smooth. So my advice is, if you have co-authors using latex and you're comfortable with latex, go ahead with it. But if your co-authors are not very familiar with latex and you're not very familiar with latex, go with Microsoft Word. That's what I personally feel.
Yeah, so we have a lot of questions coming from the audience. Sir, what do you think? Should we wrap up the Q&A?
I'm fine. I can take a few more minutes. That's okay.
Okay, so we will take a few questions because we have a time constraint as well. So what does it really meant by a double-blind conference? Is there a higher chance in getting published if the conference is double-blind?
Yeah, so double-blind basically means you have, the authors don't really know who you are. Sorry, the reviewers don't really know who you are, right? So that means you don't know. You also don't know who the reviewers are. The reviewers also don't know who the authors are. So that sort of insulates you from the likelihood of having a risk. That insulates you from being penalized based on being part of this research group or from this country. Because, let's face it, sometimes you have certain discrimination that may happen in academia also. There are biases. Some journals are more biased towards publishing works coming from certain parts of the world, from certain research groups, and so on. So double blind basically eliminates that, and that basically depersonalizes your work so that essentially they are looking at it completely as if without any understanding of who you are. So that actually helps you to improve your chances of publishing in a way. So I think, double blind is good. But what I've experienced is one of my favorite journals, European Journal of Operational Research, is single blind. So reviewers really know who you are, but we don't really know who the reviewers are. Yesterday we got a paper accepted, and my experience is it's really nice. You actually get really personalized comments. They give you good feedback. The experience is much more personal when it's single blind, and you learn a lot. Double blind is people are a little reluctant to be very, expressive in their comments. They are afraid and so on. It's 2 different ball games, but double blind is really good in a context if you feel that the reviewers might, pick on you and be a little a little what do you say, harsh on you because you come from Sri Lanka or a particular university or something like that. Because let's face it, there has been a lot of publications on being a bias. There being a bias of allowing more publications from developed world and so on. So that can be eliminated through this.
Thank you, sir. Is it possible to publish research successfully at an undergraduate level without a supervisor?
I would say very difficult. The reason that I'm saying is, I'm not saying impossible, I'm saying difficult. The reason is research is not something that you can self-learn. It's a process. So you need to understand the process. You need to understand the process of doing a research, how to do a literature review, how to do the data analysis, how to collect the data, how to write the paper. And even after writing the paper, there's a lot of management, the corresponding what has to do in terms of picking the journal, putting it out there, corresponding with the editors, the reviewers. And when the reviewers come back to you, you can't just argue with the reviewers. You need to come up with a proper justification of why your paper is important. You need to prepare several documents justifying what you have done. And there's an iterative process. And all of that requires experience. I don't think it can be self-learned, or I don't think all of it can be self-learned. Certain things can be, but not entirely. So I think initially you need to have a supervisor, but maybe if you go to, once you graduate, once you do 1 or 2 projects and successfully publish, you will learn it on your own, and then you can do things on your own. That's how I feel.
Yeah, so due to time restrictions, this will be the last question that we will be taking. Sure. How to improve active reading? Could you provide some tips for a beginner researcher?
Yeah, so I think one of the important things for you to do is you need to, like what I mentioned in the slide deck also, you need to use really good ways of pacing yourself through the papers. So read the more important parts. Don't get yourself mired into methodologies and things like that at the very beginning. Try to read it from different bits and pieces of it, what is relevant for you. And also, whenever you read something, go to the reference list. Refer to what has been already mentioned in the reference list, and then go back and try to find that literature and read it. So continuously try to develop the pool of papers. And that's something that leads to a very, very rich assortment of literature that can give you a lot of insights. And once you start reading, it becomes like a hobby. It becomes something very important and very useful. And that's one of the things that I want to tell you. But another important thing is, reading is an art, and it's not something that everyone will be doing the same way. So you will have different people will have different ways of doing it. You have morning people, right? You might be waking up at 5 in the morning. You might want to start the day by reading an article. There might be others who might be inclined to stay late night, right? I have some students who work till like 3 or 4 in the morning. I can't even catch them until about 12 in the noon. I'm fine with that. I'm not saying it's bad, but whatever works for you should be the way that you should be approaching. In my personal perspective, I need to be in the mood. I need to be in that headspace to read and grasp things. And you need to come up with your own codification codes to properly assort things, to see which paper had which point and so on. So that's something that I think you need to be very cognizant of. Try to understand yourself and how you can grasp content when you're reading, because that's the most important. Not just the number of papers you read, but how many papers you read properly to grasp the content. So understanding yourself plays an important role, because if you can sit down and concentrate entirely on the paper and understand the content properly, that helps a lot. Rather than, if you can read 1 paper and do that, that will help you rather than reading 10 papers just superficially. So that's something that I have to tell. Another important thing I forgot to mention in the last slide, so not really related to this. I think acknowledging in your paper also, when you write a paper, acknowledging the people that supported you is very important. So in a thesis, you'd acknowledge your family and so on and so forth. But in a paper, you can briefly acknowledge any grants that you have received. If you've got data from a particular organization or a particular entity or particular people, you can acknowledge that. So that's also something very useful. I think that's something that many Sri Lankans sometimes forget to do, but that's something I strongly recommend.
Thank you very much, sir, for all those comprehensive answers. I'm sure the doubts our audience had were cleared. And thank you for the audience as well for being so enthusiastic and directing your questions. So now, in order to deliver the vote of thanks, I would like to invite the project co-chair, Sajiva Sirivadan. Over to you.
Thank you, Jayada. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of IEEE Professional Communication Society, Student Branch Chapter of University of Moratuwa, I take this opportunity to propose a vote of thanks to those who have directly and indirectly contributed to this webinar on Beginner's Guide to Research Communication. First of all, I would like to thank our webinar speaker, Dr. Nilas Pereira, for enlightening us with his knowledge on research communication. It gave us guidance on how to write a research paper successfully. And I'm pretty sure the knowledge that you gave us will definitely help us in our future research paper. I would also like to thank Professor Buddhika Jayasekara, Program Co-Chair, and all the other organizing committee members of MERCON 2021 for giving us this opportunity to organize this webinar session. I would also like to thank Dr. Anga Rodrigo, the chapter advisor for the IEEE Program Student Branch Chapter for the support lended, and I'm thankful for Mr. Mavin De Silva, lecturer at the Department of Transport and Logistic Management for the logistics support. I'm extremely thankful for the support lended by Pesla Ravin and his team of officials of the IEEE Student Branch of University of Moratuwa. Last but not least, I want to thank the IEEE Procom Society Student Branch Chapter members who really worked hard to make this event successful. Special thanks goes out to the Chair of our Society, Amaya, Project Co-Chair Dylan, and all the other committee members for helping. Also, thank you to all the undergraduates present here for your participation. Thank you. Have a good night and be safe. Over to you, Jayada.
Thank you, Sajiva. We are very grateful for Dr. Nilas Pereira for taking time from his busy schedule to do this session and enlighten the young minds who are present here today. So I'm sure it helped them to expand their horizons of the subject massively. So please accept this token of appreciation on behalf of the IEEE Professional Communication Society Student Branch Chapter of University of Moratuwa. Thank you very much, sir. We appreciate your presence here today. And thank you for answering all the questions as well, even though it is way past the time. Thank you. We are really grateful.
Thank you so much. And I really want to appreciate everyone for organizing the event. And I should also mention this, that if there are any follow-up questions to what I have delivered, I'm more than happy to help. So if anyone wants some clarifications or you want to follow up on anything that was covered, feel free to drop me an email. I'd be happy to respond. Yeah, sorry, just wanted to say that out. Yeah.
Yes, because we had so many questions as well. So you can clarify them by emailing Dr. Nilas. So we have come to the end of the session. The common facts of today are the products of yesterday's research. We hope that the knowledge you gain from today's session will pave the way for you to do your part to make the world a better place tomorrow. Keep learning and keep on growing. We will see you in another fruitful session just like this in the future. Until then, stay safe and have a good night.